The Lord has done great things for us, and we are glad indeed. Restore our fortunes, O Lord, like the water courses of the Negev. Those who sowed with tears will reap with songs of joy. Those who go out weeping, carrying the seed, will come again with joy, shouldering their sheaves. 3.5 years ago, my husband Giuliano and I traveled to Ukraine for a week. We were there for the dedication of an art installation that was also a memorial for victims of a World War II genocide. Giuliano had made the installation a reality through the job he had at the time. And little did we know that a few months later, war would come again for the people of Ukraine. While we were there, we were mostly in the capital, Kyiv, but on a day off from Giuliano's work responsibilities, we embarked on an excursion to Chernobyl. Some of you may know, and some of you may not, that in the years before the war, Chernobyl had actually become a tourist destination. Not on a massive scale, mind you, but a few hundred people a day would show up to the armed border of the Chernobyl exclusion zone. And despite multiple radiation checks throughout the course of a day, it was actually fairly safe to be there. People work there, and a few people live there. There's even a hotel in town Chernobyl itself where tourists and shift workers can stay. There are, of course, areas of the zone that have higher levels of contamination, of radiation, and they're not safe to stay for long. But the Chernobyl exclusion zone is pretty big, for comparison about twice the size of Monmouth County. And before the accident at the nuclear power plant in 1986, the area was home to 120,000 people living in two cities, Chernobyl and Pripyat, as well as 187 small rural farming communities. All of these people were forced to move from their homes after the disaster. They were resettled in other places, mostly Kyiv, but especially for the people who lived on the land, the farmers, city life was just not the same. So a few years after the disaster, people actually started going back. They were very secretive at first. They had to cross borders like migrants. And they found, though, once they got there, that some of their homes were not radioactive. And so some people moved back permanently. Giuliano's friend who arranged this tour for us knew that some of these settlers, as they were called, she knew some of these settlers. And so on the way to the zone, we stopped at a supermarket at her request and did some shopping for them. You see, you cannot get fresh dairy in Chernobyl. After entering the outer ring of the exclusion zone, the 30-kilometer checkpoint, we went to visit a settlement. And we met two women in their 80s. Both lived alone, each a short walk from the other. It was a nice day, so they had us sit outside at a table, and immediately they began serving us food they'd grown in their gardens in Chernobyl. Now, a little concerned, but not wanting to be rude, I started taking small bites. By the way, the potatoes were delicious, but as soon as our host stepped back into the kitchen, I asked our guide, "Is it really safe to eat food grown in the ground here?" And he said, "Look at those two women. They've been living here for over 30 years. We should be so lucky to be as vibrant and strong at their age." He had a point. He explained that this part of the exclusion zone was completely free of radiation. And yet, even there, in that safe part of the zone, children were not allowed. And so to see their grandchildren, the women there have to travel to the capital. And it was clear that our hosts enjoyed having us visit because, in part, they're isolated and don't often see their loved ones very often. And most tourists who enter the zone don't stop in for a visit. But these women, even though they're isolated, and there are some others like them, but they're spread out throughout the zone, and so they're not, next to one another. So they're fairly isolated, and yet they want to be there. They don't want to be in the big city because there they were exiles. There they were refugees from a disaster. But here was the life they knew. Here, they said, is home. And it was clear from the smiles on their faces and the pride with which they served us, their produce from their gardens, that their life was joyous despite challenges. When the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, then were we like those who dream. And then was our mouth filled with laughter and our tongue with shouts of joy. Those who sowed the tears will reap with songs of joy. Those who go out weeping, carrying the seed, will come again with joy, shouldering their sheaves. Psalm 126 has long been one of my favorites. It's a song of celebration, and yet it's also a text of longing. Holding both of these emotions at once, it's a complex statement, a nuanced prayer. And for me, that rings true with the human experience generally, when we have so much to be grateful for, and yet also so much that draws our concern. The psalm was likely written in the context of the end of the Babylonian exile in the 6th century before the birth of Christ. The exile began when the kingdom of Judah was conquered by the Babylonian Empire. When Jerusalem fell, many were captured and dispersed to work throughout Mesopotamia. At the end of the exile, Israelites were free to move back to their homeland, and yet life was forever changed. So many would never return. Celebration then was bittersweet. But nevertheless, the people did celebrate because they were home again. The hard work that waited for them there was joyous because it was their land and their crops for which they were toiling, sowing and reaping and shouldering their sheaves. Just like those tough octogenarian former exiles from Chernobyl who proudly and joyously served me their delicious potatoes grown from their own gardens. As I researched Psalm 126 this week, I learned that an anniversary of its use in a remarkable setting had just passed by. On March 26, 1979, Menachem Begin, then the Prime Minister of Israel, recited the psalm as part of his speech at the signing ceremony of the Egypt-Israel peace treaty during the second round of the Camp David Accords. The famous image of Begin, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, and U.S. President Jimmy Carter joyfully clasping hands together was the culmination of a peace effort that was as personal as it was political. The negotiations that led to the treaty were not easy, and both Sadat and Begin threatened to withdraw at various points. When the delegations had reached a particularly difficult impasse, Begin was preparing to leave when he asked Carter for an autograph for his children, signed on a photo with the three leaders together. Carter later said that his secretary brought him 8 individual photos and provided him with names of each of the prime minister's 8 grandchildren. Instead of merely signing at Jimmy Carter, as he usually did on these photos, he signed "with love to," and then wrote the name of each grandchild. Despite asking for the favor, Begin was angry and barely speaking with Carter at this point. And so when the president dropped by his cabin to deliver the stack of photos, the prime minister quickly thanked him and turned away, effectively dismissing him. But then, according to Carter, he looked down and he read the first photograph and he called out the name of his granddaughter. And then one by one, he took the photos and read out the names of his 8 grandchildren. Tears ran down his cheeks, and Carter said that when I saw them, I also cried. And the prime minister said, "Why don't we try one more time?" And of course, we know history teaches us that they came to the negotiating table one more time, and they did sign the treaty. And that peace held between Israel and Egypt, but it came at a price. The concessions of the treaty contributed to unrest in Egypt and Sadat's eventual assassination. I was born a few years after the Camp David Accords, but in my own lifetime, I watched on television as PLO chaired Yasser Arafat and Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin shook hands in the White House lawn at the signing of the Oslo Peace Accord in 1993. And I vividly remember when Rabin was murdered 2 years later in 95, killed by an extremist from his own country who was opposed to the peace process. Peace is not easy. Fighting for peace is sometimes as dangerous as war. And the maintenance of true peace, like personal relationships, requires intentionality, mutuality, compromise, and vulnerability. Vulnerability like that shown between a U.S. president and a prime minister those years ago, and a connection over grandchildren and the hope for peace. In today's connected world, one nation's experience of peace too often comes with the recognition that some others around the world are at war. One individual's freedom and success in life is so often not without the awareness of those less fortunate. The end of exile does not mean that everyone has made it home. And yet, with the psalmist, we are called to rejoice in each moment of hope and restoration. And this, I think, is what Jesus means in today's rather enigmatic and potentially frustrating conclusion to the gospel reading when he says, "You always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me." His words can easily be misunderstood, and they seem almost callous in their disregard for the daily trauma, humiliation, and oppression of living in poverty. But it's important to remember the context. It's important to remember that Jesus himself is a person who lived on the margins. As a baby, he was a refugee. After the return from exile, he grew up among the working class of a small village in a colonized land, ruled with an iron fist by a powerful empire. He was well acquainted with poverty and oppression. He was not a rich person talking about the poor in an abstract sense. He was talking about his friends. And in the context of history, he was talking about his people, the people of Psalm 126, which he would have known by heart, people of exile and return. "You always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me," must be read in the context of that psalm that reminds us that even today, there are many who have been displaced from their homes, who just want a place to breathe free and call their own. And never forgetting the struggle, weeping with those who weep, we also rejoice with those who rejoiced. There are many occasions to sow with tears, and so may we even ever more vigorously reap with songs of joy. Because joy is what will give us the strength to meet the challenges that come our way. Joy is powerful. Joy is our best resistance to the forces of hate and oppression and death. Joy is the natural state we were meant to inhabit. And when we return from the exile of sorrow, joy is our home. Amen.